engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to The People's Historian, a weekly podcast that takes you on a journey through time with amazing stories from our collective past. Your host, Professor of History and Professional Public Historian, Dr. Gabriel Selassie. Today we're going to talk about Bernie Sanders and socialism in the Black community. You're going to want to stick around for this because I think I have some pretty provocative things to say that might not go over too well with the Black community. Stay tuned. I'm making this podcast because I had a really fascinating discussion with a former classmate of mine. I went to an HBCU in the South, and on Facebook, as you're probably full aware that there's all kinds of political discussions going on Facebook. And I had this discussion with a classmate of mine about Bernie Sanders and socialism. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but the conversation devolved into something like this. I'm not voting for Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders and those socialists, all they want to do is take from me and give free stuff to freeloaders, people who don't want to work. And when I pressed him a lot further, what it basically boils down to is that he believes that socialism is the idea that you don't have to work and people just hand you free stuff, whether it be free college education or whether it would be free health care. It all boils down to is that socialists want a society where they don't want to work. Now, for me, as an African-American and a historian who teaches African-American studies, particularly Black politics, that was extremely startling to me and troubling because a fellow HBCU graduate has been completely cut off from his own intellectual and political history. Now, what this podcast is about is I'm going to go into just a little bit of history to sort of make these connections between the Black community and socialism and communism, etc. To give you a hint, right? Because ultimately in a podcast here, we only have so many minutes, but you're going to have to do your own research. But I just want to talk about this for a few minutes about the idea how a college graduate from a historically Black college could fundamentally believe that Black young people are being brainwashed because all socialism wants to do is to give people free stuff. Now, my talk today is going to go back a little bit further and talk a little bit about what socialism is, about its linkages to the Black community. And I'm going to, of course, what I do with most of my podcasts, because I get a lot of people who say, you need to provide the sources for this kind of stuff. I'm going to give you some sources, and I'd like for you to start off, if you're really interested in this topic, and reading a book by historian Eric Williams, who wrote a book called Slavery and Capitalism. Eric Williams was a fascinating individual. He was born in 1911 and died, I think, in 1981. He was actually an Oxford-trained historian, and he was also Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And in this book, what Williams does is that, such a revolutionary book, is that he explained how slavery fueled the Industrial Revolution in England, how the accumulation of vast fortunes in Europe was manifested from cotton production in the U.S. South, shipbuilding, banking, heavy industry, how European wealth was created off the backs of African labor. And if you want to know just some statistics about the numbers of slaves, you can just type in transatlantic slave trade database in your URL, and there's a fascinating website put together by historians who've been collecting data on all the slave ships that they can find, the primary sources, and putting them in a database where you can actually query and find out where the ships came from, where they disembarked from Africa, where they landed in the Americas, both the United States, Central Mexico, Central South America. And the numbers that they've collected are about 12.5 million slaves were brought to the Americas. And of course, you know that by the end of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, there were roughly about 4 million blacks enslaved in the United States. So what Eric Williams does for us is that he locates and centers this idea that black people were cogs in the building of American capitalism and witnessed firsthand their own economic exploitation. So the idea here being is that black people automatically, fundamentally understood from slavery to the outset of slavery to freedom that their labor was inherently being used to accumulate vast sums of wealth for other people at their expense. So black people automatically had a sort of built-in reservoir of a critique of the capitalist enterprise. So while very few black people at the end of the Civil War had actually read Marx, they would have no problem in understanding Marx's critique of capitalism. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, this is Marxism, and oh, this is bad Marxism. Well, I'm going to tell you that if you haven't read Das Kapital by Marx, you have nothing to say. How are you going to critique Marx when you haven't even read Marx? And yes, I'm on my third reading of Marx. A lot of it I don't understand. For one, I don't like reading literature. As a matter of fact, I hate it. I only want to read history books. But I've had to read things like Balzac because when I've quickly realized that when I'm reading Marx, that there are things that he's saying that I don't understand. Why is he saying this? And then you have a deep understanding that he is a scholar and a fluent expert on French culture. And so he's drawing a lot from literary sources that I just know nothing about. So I've had to force myself to read this kind of stuff. And I'm getting better at it, right? So what I'm getting here is the idea that black people are fundamentally, at the end of slavery, amenable to these ideas of socialism, Marxism, and communism. And so what we have after the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, where black people are leaving the South by the thousands, and they're also being recruited by industrialists to come up to the North to work in their factories, right? So black people from the Great Migration flood into city centers of the North, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Gary, Flint, Los Angeles, Oakland, etc., in search of work, working in the motor car companies and Kaiser Shipbuilding in Oakland and Los Angeles. And black people quickly realize that they have escaped one form of slavery for another. They found conditions better in the North, but the exploitation and racism still rife. Read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Philadelphia, where he shows that the conditions for black people in Philadelphia in the late 19th century were no better than, say, conditions for industrial workers in Charles Dickens' novels. And Charles Dickens wasn't writing just hypothetically. There was plenty of examples that he could just look out of his window and see. The whole English population was basically still locked in a form of industrial serfdom. In many cases, blacks were used as scab labor to keep wages down for both whites and blacks in these factories. By the time black people moved through the Gilded Age of the late 1890s and into the early 20th centuries, it did not pass by many black people from the Caribbean to Africa to the United States, from all sectors, whether black people were poor or wealthy, that laissez-faire capitalism was detrimental to black prosperity. So by the early 20th century, blacks began to consider alternative forms of economic systems. And it was quite evident from just picking up a newspaper in the early 19-teens that socialism was providing a counter-narrative to this form of laissez-faire capitalism. All one had to do, if one had acquired a seemingly decent education, was to pick up a book and read Marx. It was right there. So how do we define then socialism? That's quite a little bit of a hurdle. And what I'm going to do is not so much define socialism in terms of giving you just a patent definition from some website or something to that nature. I'm just going to outline very briefly what socialism is and as a counter narrative to what capitalism is. And of course, you should have some idea that socialism was being practiced everywhere in the world in some particular forms, right, before the 19th century, right? As a matter of fact, what I would argue is that slave plantations had some form of socialist system inherently built in it. And I would even argue that the entire South was a socialist experiment, right, coupled with laissez-faire capitalism. Right? Because in many cases, we don't have any real true systems of anything, right? There's no real true system of capitalism anywhere, and there's no real true system of socialism anywhere. We usually have some forms of mixed systems. Well, these first modern socialists of the 19th century were people like Charles Owen, Charles Fourier, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Louis Blanc, and Saint-Simon. Right? These people were writing about the excesses of poverty and inequality of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, if we go back to Williams, who argues that slavery and capitalism fueled the Industrial Revolution, these critics of capitalism were advocating some form of egalitarian distribution of wealth and the transformation of society into small communities where private property was to be abolished. Oh, I know what you're saying, abolishing private property, somebody's going to come take my house. No, that's not what they're saying. What the basic deal is for people who are living in the 18th, 19th centuries is that a lot of people made their wealth from charging exorbitant rents. Right? So today we have a much more robust economy where people are making money off of rents, but back during this time period, rents were a large portion of how people made money, and so they could see inherently in the charging of exorbitant rents to poor people, former serfs who had been kicked off their land from the enclosure movement, particularly in England, who were now having to find places to live and to work in these factories, making pennies on the dollar, that these individuals, right, if we could abolish rents and private property, that people would have inherently places to live. That was the fundamental idea. And of course, things have changed so much. But still, we have that, right? Try to afford an apartment in New York or Los Angeles. It's absolutely incredible what my students pay for rent, right? Some of them are paying up to $2,000 a month for rent, so they have to work, right? And that's a whole different discussion about students, right, who can't afford to even go to college. Right, it's much harder. I think my college education, when I was an undergraduate, I think that I probably paid in total maybe about $6,000 or $7,000 to $10,000, maybe. Things have changed. Now, how do I define socialism? Well, let's start defining capitalism. Capitalism, at its fundamental state, is that the means of production is owned and controlled by private hands. Privately, that there is a system of free or wage labor, open markets, and capital accumulation. Now, if we counter that with a definition of socialism, it means that the means of production, and what we mean by the means of production are factories, right? The things that make stuff. The means of production is under social and democratic control. Workers should control their own labor. Workers should have a say in what goes on in their places of work. Profits are not the main motivator of work. That capital accumulation for its own sake, just to be rich, is not the main motivator. And I'll give you an example because I know what's popping off in your head. Venezuela. You're thinking about, well, let's take a look what happens when we try socialism in Venezuela. Right? I never hear of anything counter to that, right? We never hear right, where we have mixed systems like in Northern Europe or in Great Britain, which is uber capitalist, but they have mixed systems. But we always hear, oh, Venezuela. I'll give you a perfect example of a socialist system. And this is the Mondragon Corporation, 1956. It was founded by a Catholic priest under the idea of Catholic social teaching. Revenues today are $12 billion. Total assets are $24 billion with 74,000 employees worldwide. Even here in the United States, steel manufacturers asked the Mondragon Corporation to come over to America to set up co-ops for them. The Mondragon Corporation works democratically because the workers are in control of how much they make and how much the CEOs and the managers make in their corporations. So here in the United States, for example, the corporate CEO makes 12 to 1, 19 to 1, 20 to 1, or even higher above what the average worker who's actually producing the products. Mondragon Corporation, it's about 3 to 1. Now, we can't say that everything at the Mondragon Corporation is perfect, right? We can look at some of their externalities because they're operating within a capitalist global economy. So there are things about them that I don't like, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, this is a far cry in the fact that in the United States, we have to have a minimum wage because if we did not, your employer would pay you less money. And that is inherently wrong. Now, black people in the 1920s were deeply attracted to both the Socialist Party USA and the Communist Party of the United States. Eugene Debs, who was a presidential candidate for the Socialist Party in 1912 and again in 1920, he was briefly imprisoned for sedition by the United States government. The Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama, they were supported. Their lawyer was hired by the Communist Party of the United States. Angela Davis, Claude McKay, the poet, Richard Wright, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Gwendolyn Brooks were all Communist Party members. Rosa Parks, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. were all in some way affiliated or trained by the Communist Party of the United States. We have a long tradition of socialist and communist history within the black community. The African Blood Brotherhood in the 1920s, the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s. So it was quite shocking to me when my classmate believed that socialism was about helping people get stuff free rather than being a vanguard, a bulwark against the oppression of black communities. So what has happened? Why is it that the black community in and of itself no longer has any direct connection to socialism and capitalism? And it's quite easy. The black community has been completely cut off from its own intellectual and political history. In the 1970s, when desegregation gripped America, black people began to retreat into white spheres of work, housing, and social influence. The avenues to create wealth opened up, particularly in sports and music for black people. I can remember Ebony magazine reading it as a child, and you would open this beautiful magazine up, which we all look forward to, that and Jet magazine, right? Remember Jet? We would open up these magazines, and in the main cover story would always be about some athlete, some singer, or somebody who was wealthy, and they showed the extravagance of how they lived. And it was a real source of pride for black people to see these people because we could say to ourselves, wow, we're making it. We're living just like white folks. White colleges began to hire black professors to teach black radical politics. Cedric Robinson, who was author of Black Marxism, an absolute fantastic book that chronicles this Black radical politics history. He taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And his mentor, Robin Kelly, his protege, Robin Kelly, teaches at the University of California at Los Angeles. Democratic Socialist and my fraternity brother, Cornel West, has never taught at an HBCU. So we have Black academics and intellectuals who are teaching Black radical politics to white kids who don't want to hear this. The Black community has been completely bought off, neutered. Its entire Black radical tradition has been pulled out from under the community with complacency and credit cards. Let me give you some statistics here. Black unemployment during the Great Recession was at 17%. Today, it's about 6%. The median household income today is about $28,000 less than the average white household. Black women earn 61 cents for every dollar a white man earned in 2017. Black wealth is about $17,000, and I think that's highly inflated. I think it's really about $6,000. And white wealth is well over $100,000. The system of capitalism as outlined by Marx exploits Black people. Now, I understand capitalism isn't all bad, right? We enjoy the clothes and the cell phones and the cool stuff that we have and the trappings of capitalism. That's cool stuff, right? The cameras and the computers and all of that trapping. And Black people want some of that stuff too. But I have to tell you that Bernie Sanders never stood a chance with Black people because Black people's complete sellout to corporate America. When white America wants to learn about the pulse of Black America, it doesn't talk to Cornel West. They look to billionaire and high school graduate Jay-Z. And Black people respond in kind. Let me just show you and demonstrate to you how deep this sort of decoupling of the Black community and its own political history, its own intellectual history has occurred. Now, I'm going to read off some names. And I want you to tell me how many of these people that you actually know. You can send me a message or, right, if we see you down the road, you can let me know. But I'm just going to see if you can mark off how many of these people that you have actually ever heard of. Edward Wilmot Blyden, Henry McNeil Turner, Hubert Harrison, William Monroe Trotter, Deuce Muhammad Ali, Archibald Grimke, Martin Delaney, Alexander Crummell, James T. Hawley, Henry Highland Garnett. How many of them do you actually know? Go ahead, ask any Black person to give you just one or two names of books that Martin Luther King wrote. Ask any Black person to just give you a simple overview of Martin Luther King's civil rights program. And I would dare say that very few people could actually tell you anything about Martin Luther King other than the fact that he was some great Black leader sometime. It was too late for Sanders and the Black community. Older Black people are completely cut off from their own history. What Sanders needed to do, and this was years ago, right? He should have been doing this in the past 4 years, is that he needed to put on some damn overalls, learn how to play dominoes, or as we say, bones in the Black community, eat some barbecue and explain to Black people how his form of democratic socialism is good for Black people. Right? So, for example, in Canada, as our largest trading partner, they're uber capitalists with common sense. Everyone has a health card. So, with our current situation in the United States, where the economy is humming along thanks to Barack Obama, we are absolutely in a phase where as long as Black people are seemingly thinking that they are on an easy street, even though the unemployment rate for black people is still relatively high to white people. There's no hope for Bernie Sanders. What people want is to be able to get up in the morning, to use their credit cards, to pay for their seemingly weak lifestyle as it is today. And Joe Biden is going to deliver that to them, the status quo. Well, that's going to be it for this podcast episode. I am your host, Dr. Gabriel Selassie, the People's Historian.